Okay, I have good news. I finished the book. Finished the book yesterday, and now we begin the process of really using the Antinet, the Zettelkasten. So, what I want to do is pull Sherlock out here. Oh my, we have a very close angle here. I was hoping you'd be able to see me sift through the cards a little better, but we'll do what we can. So, a couple ideas I want to share from finishing the book and starting to make cards. Number one point that I want to make is once you start making cards, it's like opening a floodgate. It's incredible. To a there's a certain point where I found myself standing there just with my mind blown. I couldn't believe how many cards I was producing, and I'm not talking low quality cards. These were high quality cards, and it wasn't even all coming from text. I'd start with something from a bib card, and then it would remind me of something, and then that would remind me of something, and that would remind me of something. Next thing I knew, I had 5 cards in a string, in a thread. So in one day, I went from having about 5 or 6 cards in here. These are all blank cards back here, so ignore those. I went from having 5 or 6 cards to this, which is approximately 50 cards. And as you can see, those aren't blank. So I 10 timed my output in one day. Now, granted, I will say that I am doing more than the advised couple hours a day. I honestly, I work when I work. I do the whether it is through reading or through making cards. I work for as long as it's fun. And maybe because it's new and I'm just finally getting into it after reading this 600-page book, I'm finally getting into it. Maybe I'm a little more jazzed on it than I will be later. But yesterday, we'll just talk about yesterday, which is when I made these cards. I finished up the book, which is about 2 hours in the morning. So I read for 2 hours in the morning, finished the book. Then I started making cards, and I made cards for 2.5 hours. So this is the result of, not counting other days of reading, this is a result of 4.5 hours of work. So I might not be producing 50 cards a day, but I know I can easily produce 5 or 10 quality cards every day without any effort and with it being a blast. It really is fun. There's an elation that comes when thoughts start connecting, and when you're doing this and thoughts start connecting, wow, it's pretty incredible. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. So if you haven't done this yet, if you haven't been making cards yet, if you're a newbie to the whole Zettelkasten thing, I just want to let you know all of the things you're worrying about, all of the category stuff, which we're going to talk about next, all of that stuff, once you start making cards, it's gone. You don't have to worry about it. Because once you start making cards, everything kind of clicks in place and it just starts happening. Your brain starts going crazy because this really does work the way your brain works. I think that's what's going on. Is your brain going, oh, finally, something that works the way I do. And it's just conducive to it. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Second, I want to talk about categories. This is going to be hard because of this angle, but here's some of my categories. Zettelkasten, physical health, rediscovering analog, political theory, freedoms, creativity, and project ideas. So those are all based off of my theory that, well, not my theory, my belief in more of what Luhmann did. I like the idea that essentially his categories were based on projects. And I think considering the amount of papers he wrote, I think essentially when he decided he was going to write a paper, he created a category. But I'll tell you this. If there are people out there debating the difference between this and what Scott does with the intellectual disciplines, there's no point in worrying about it. Because once you start making cards, the categories, they really don't mean very much. They don't mean much at all. And I'm going to show you an example of why I say that. But I'll tell you abstractly first. They don't mean much because when you're stringing cards together, this one, 1A and then 1A1 and then 1A1B. Once you start doing that, within just a couple cards, you're no longer in the category that you're writing about. So it doesn't really matter. These just serve as kind of like a grounding for you to feel like, okay, I kind of have an idea of what this general area is mostly about. And it also gives you a place beyond the index to search for things. If you're looking for if I'm looking for something about Zettelkasten, yeah, I'm probably going to find it in the Zettelkasten section, but not necessarily. There's stuff in all these sections that relate to Zettelkasten at this point, because I just read a book about Zettelkasten and I'm still making bib card notes. Making main cards from my bib card. So any idea that fits in these other categories is going to come from a book about Zettelkasten. So in a way, most of these are going to be related to Zettelkasten. So the categories are not super important. And to reiterate that, I'm going to show you an example of how quickly they veer into a different topic. And in doing so, I'm also going to cover some other topics that I wanted to share that I've learned. And those ideas are on the cards we're going to look at. So let's go to 1-4. And I want these 3 cards. Just in 3 cards, watch how quickly our topic changes. Okay, so this first card, I'm talking about this idea that I had. I had this idea that perhaps when I have, for example, when you write something and you need to make an addendum. So, for example, if I just said, for example, like 3 times. That's the problem with not editing. You look like an idiot sometimes. So let's pretend this card was we'll say it was a list. As a list of some sort. Maybe it's a list of healthy work behaviors for getting things done, we'll say. And it's a list of my own. It's not something I've pulled from someone else. It's a list of my own. And let's say I go, okay, I make another card behind it, 1.4a. And then later I go, oh, I have more to add to that list. And let's just assume I used the back already. What am I going to do? Well, I think what I originally thought was, oh, maybe I'll just create another dot. So then it would be, instead of 1.4a, it would be 1.4.1. As you can see, I was kind of reasoning that out there. But then I started realizing that would kind of mess up the threading. It would make things weird. Like, do the dots come here? Where do they go? It's not a natural place for me, so I would probably mess up the filing of it. So what I realized I was going to do instead is, if I have to make an addendum to a card, like I want something that's attached to this card that everything else is going to come after, that's when I would use capital letters. So 1.4 capital A. And then everything after the capital letters comes the lowercase letters. Or if it's a number, if I was going to place a card after this already ends in a letter, that's okay. I can put lowercase a, capital A, and that would be an addendum. And then the numbers can start after that. And I'm not sure if that's what Lumen was doing with the capital letters. You see that he uses capital and lowercase, but it seems like that's possible. That's what he was doing. And I think it's a way of avoiding using too many periods or commas or dashes. I don't like using more than one. My numbering scheme, this is it. And the thread's just going to continue from here. I'm not going to use any more periods, any more dashes. This is sufficient for me. And it also avoids one of the things Scott does, which is use zeros and negative numbers. I'm not a fan of that. It's complicating something simple, and I don't want to complicate something simple. So for me, it's about using the capital letters. That's what I'm going to do. I haven't had to use it yet, but here's an example of 1.4 lowercase a, 3 lowercase a, capital A. So that would mean that's an addendum to that card. So that's one of the things that I was thinking about in here. So we have 1.4a. We start with this idea about numbering schemes. And then the card that goes below that, 1.4a, this is from the book. that the Zettelkasten numbering works despite errors. In fact, altering card addresses is virtually impossible due to the linking structure, an activity which also wastes time. So what I'm saying here is I'm just reiterating. I'm reformulating something from Scott, saying that the numbering thing, it works no matter what. You make errors, you number something wrong. Oh well, you can still find it because of the index and so forth. And I added this part. This part is my own thought, is that actually when you think about having to go change the number on a card, that would mean you have to go through all of your index and make sure that you change that number on all the index cards. And then you have to go through all of your cards to make sure you're not linking to that card somewhere else. So changing an address of a card is virtually impossible. So we're still talking about numbering schemes here. So 2 cards. Here comes the third card, 1.41a. The resistance to changing addresses in Zettelkasten forces you to embrace imperfection. Now, we're still on Zettelkasten, but can you see where the next card in this would go? The next time I have a card about imperfection, I'm probably going to put it after this. So in the span of 4 cards, which would be the next one I haven't made yet, I'm already out of the Zettelkasten category. So categories don't matter because you're not going to stay in them. That's the nature of the way this numbering scheme works. You're threading thoughts. This reminds me of this, and you always want to put the card closest to the card that is the most relevant to it. And in this case, the most relevant card for a card about imperfection is probably this one. So that next card will probably not be about Zettelkasten, even though it will be in the Zettelkasten category. So categories, not important. Okay, let's go over a couple more. Let's go into the creativity section here. This one, 7.1a, 1a1. So this is a quote from Scott's book. He would read, and we're referencing Luminaire, he would read philosophy and sociology and then reformulate and reflect on the readings by expressing them on paper via writing by hand with a pen. After this, he would install into his Antinet the thoughts from these conversations between him and the author he was reading. This, to me, seems to insinuate that the 2-step bib process that Scott describes is actually 3 steps. I may be reading this wrong, but if I am, then this seems like a good idea and I might try this anyways. But what it sounds like here is he's got his notes on his bib card. Here, let's grab a bib card. He's got his brief notes on his bib card. And then he's pulling out a piece of paper and a pen. And he's extrapolating on those ideas on paper. And then from here, the extrapolations on paper, he's then making his main cards. That's what it sounds like. Now, that may be just the wording here. Maybe it's just imprecise wording here. But that's what it sounds like to me. And that seems like a really interesting idea because that would allow you to take these ideas. So your ideas here are still going to be tied to the text, right? This is very closely tied to the text. So if I pull from here or I do the 1-step process with just writing directly to the card, all I'm doing is looking at this and going, what does this mean? Either I'm putting the exact quote or I'm reformulating it, which is just really rewording it, or I'm reflecting upon it. But even that is still really tied close to this text. So you're still really tied close to this person's ideas. Whereas, whoa, that was a nice little camera shake there. Sorry about that. Whereas if I don't know what to say, brainstormed or journaled or whatever and just free wrote here based off of these ideas and went on tangents on this paper, and then afterwards went through here and, just picked the best parts and then made the cards from here, this is going to be less tied to the text. It'll be derivative from it in the sense that the text is what sparked whatever thoughts come here. But what's here is going to be more my own thinking than if I pull directly from here. So I'm thinking about testing out a 3-step bib card process. I'm not positive if that's what Lumen actually did, if that's what we're talking about here, but it doesn't really matter if that's what Lumen did. It matters if it's a good practice and if it yields benefits. So I'm going to give that a shot and see how that works out. And then we have, oh yeah, this is a big one for me. What number is that? 13A. So check out this card. Notice the red. This means I added this afterwards. So originally I had this idea. Let books sit for 2 weeks after reading them before processing the links. I don't know why I wrote the links. I need to fix that. The bib notes is what I meant. Put a post-it on the cover with the review date. So for example, I finished that book yesterday. I originally put a post-it on it that said, yesterday was the 4th, so I put the 18th on here, 14 days on top of the book. I quickly realized that that's not going to work, which is why now it says don't. That's not going to work because what I realized is this one. This is the correction to it. Waiting to process main cards from reading or bib cards causes a continuity error. The information in my head is in my head already, but as I process the other cards, I'm unable to group or connect them because the cards that I want to connect them to don't exist yet. I believe now that for maximal benefit, cards must be made as soon as possible. So what I'm saying here is, say this card. This card doesn't come from anything. This is me. This is from my head. And it follows this card, which is also from my head. Okay, I think that one's from my head, but then when we go back, what do we have here? We have a card from Scott. If I didn't have this card in here, not from Scott, but from his book, if I didn't have this card in here about bib cards and index being key components of the Zettelkasten, these ideas that were in my head I wouldn't be able to place these where I wanted into the Antinet because I would want them below this idea, which is in my head. I knew this in my head because I did the reading. But these that came from my own head, my own thoughts, I couldn't install until this was installed. So to make that a little more clear, if we look at my bib card, I'm not going to make a card from all of these, but let's say half of them. Let's say I'm going to make 10 cards from this side, right? And let's say this is all I have for this book. Let's ignore the fact that this is page 2 of 3. Card 2 of 3, I should say. In addition to this, I have my own thoughts that might relate to this stuff directly, or it might just be things that I want to install that through other activities in my life, I've been coming up with cards to put in the Zettelkasten. If those cards are in my head and I want to make them, okay, let's get these out and make these are also in my head from the reading. And as I'm writing these, this is what happened to me literally. I started writing the cards that were from my own head and realizing that they related to things I read, but I couldn't put them in because I hadn't made these cards. So if I had put this aside and waited 2 weeks, I'd be stuck with stacks of cards over here that I'm like, oh, well, I know I'm going to want to put that in after I put that other thing in. So that is the continuity error I'm talking about. Is these ideas are occurring at the same time as these ideas are in my head. Some of these ideas are occurring because these ideas are in my head. So because these happen at the same time, they have to go into the box at about the same time because they're going to relate to each other. That's the whole point of creating the threading and the linking between the cards. So the cards can't sit and wait. They have to be put in here as quick as possible because everything that I make after that has the potential of connecting with something that I've just read. So that was an example we in the Antinet community, Scott talks about in his book, the idea of errors being part of the system. That was an example of an error. I had an idea in there, it was wrong. So now I have a correction of it, and now forever I'm going to have a tracking of that thought process. So that's pretty cool. All right, one more thing. Do I have one more thing? Where did I? Oh, here it is. I have a list over here, in case you're wondering why I'm saying that. I have a list to make sure that I don't go off track. Immediate availability. So one of the things, I'm not going to pull a card out for this one. One of the things that Scott talks about in the book is contribution. This becomes more useful if you move into a state of contribution as opposed to just collecting. And what he means by that is making things. Move into a state of using this stuff as immediately as possible. A little sip of water. In the case of Lumen, I mentioned earlier that his categories were probably based off papers he was writing. And what that allowed him to do was say, oh, I'm going to write a paper about Zettelkasten. So he'd do a bunch of research about Zettelkasten, end up with most of those notes probably falling into that category or all over the internet, as I said. And then afterwards, he would write a paper. He'd be able to pull these out and go, okay, let's write that paper. And then he wrote the paper. So the idea of having the work to do just of the paper focused his reading so that he could make this section, right? That he had a reason to read that. But then he had an automatic use for it, immediate use for it. And I'm still in the stage if I'm not using any of this stuff except for right now. When I talk about the Zettelkasten itself, I had an immediate use for those cards because I just shared them with you. But my reading, now that I'm done with the Zettelkasten book, my reading is not going to be about Zettelkasten. It's going to be about a lot of other things. So I've been asking myself, in what way can I make the stuff I'm using immediately useful? In what way can I move into that contribution mindset? And this is why I saved this for last. Here's what I think I'm going to do. I'm going to try it out. Once again, I'm not doing anything unless it's not fun. So I'm going to try it. If it's a struggle or if it feels like a labor, then I won't do it. But I had the idea of just taking ideas that I think, wow, that's an interesting idea. Something I learned, maybe other people will be interested in that. Using my Substack and just making short posts about them. Just here's the idea, not something elaborate, not make it feel like an article. Really just try to keep to the meat of the idea and just share the idea and not really go crazy with it. The reason for that is the longer it gets and the more I get into that formulation process, the more it becomes a labor and something I don't want to do. It needs to be something that feels like it's naturally occurring from this, not something that I'm taking this and forcing myself to do something else with. Now, Lumen probably enjoyed the process of writing papers. I don't necessarily. That may change with more practice of getting back into the swing of writing short things on a more consistent basis. I don't know. So if you're not subscribed to my Substack, subscribe to my Substack if you're interested in seeing how that works out, seeing what ideas I'm pulling out. It won't be related to Zettelkasten because, as I said, anything that's going to be related to Zettelkasten, I'm going to come here to you guys and make a video. But I mean, the other stuff, there's a lot of ideas in here about creativity and political theory and, I won't share project ideas, but rediscovering analog. These are some topics I'm focused on now, but if you could see the book pile I have, it's going to be interesting. I have specific topics that are interesting to me. Like for instance, one of the topics that's really interesting to me that I have a lot of books that I want to read about, that I want to read, are about the degradation or the falling apart of small towns in America. And I'm curious about things related to that, like what makes a town a good town, what makes people want to move there, and how do they fall apart, and how does that relate to manufacturing, and how does that relate to the economy, all these things. Even how does it relate to politics? How are people interpreting that in how they vote? Those are interesting topics to me. So that's something I would read about. Then I had an idea on top of that. Is if I took, let's look at this visually so you guys have something to look at. What do we have? Let's pull. There we go. Context alters meaning. This is from a book called Ways of Seeing by John Berger. This talks about the idea of the camera basically allowed for reproductions of art. So in other words, we'll take the Mona Lisa, the most famous picture. The Mona Lisa, before, if you wanted to see the Mona Lisa, you had to go to where the Mona Lisa was, and you had to encounter the Mona Lisa in the context of where it was placed. But because of photos and everything that came from photos, like photocopies and magazines and the internet, you're able to see the Mona Lisa in many contexts. And because of that, the meaning of the Mona Lisa changes because you see it in different contexts. If you see it on a t-shirt, so one of the pictures that they use in the book, a girl wearing a t-shirt with the Mona Lisa on it, that changes the context and it changes the meaning of the painting, to the point that they argue sometimes art becomes devoid of meaning because the context is being removed from it so completely that it no longer has meaning. So when people stand in front of paintings, all they're thinking is, wow, I'm standing in front of the painting. And they spend their time trying to come to terms with the reality that they're standing in front of the actual painting and not meditating on the meaning of the painting which the artist imbued in it. So that's an interesting idea. And I go on, for example, one of the other things they use in the book, they show the picture of a famous painting by Van Gogh of a cornfield with crows flying out of it. And it's on one page, page 27, and there it says, this is a landscape of cornfield with crows flying out of it. Think about that for a minute. Look at the picture. Now turn the page. And on page 28, it shows the same picture and it says, this is the last picture Van Gogh painted before killing himself. The meaning of the painting suddenly changes because the context of the words. That while we don't know why necessarily it changes meaning, it does. It suddenly means something different. That the context alters meaning. Okay? So that's the card. And I could do what I just did there and put that into a pretty concise little blog entry. Then what I'm considering doing is, if the blog entry thing is working, also making a podcast episode where instead of just keeping tight on the idea like I do in the blog, ramble on it, extrapolate on it, stretch the idea out, talk about it a little bit more. So those are some ideas I'm considering. Let me know your thoughts on that. Does that sound interesting? I mean, it sounds interesting to me. It's something I probably would be interested in, but I'm curious if other people agree with me. You know, it's okay. If nobody does, I'd probably do it anyways, but that's where I am. I'm done with the book. I'm steadily on my way, and as a matter of fact, after I finish filming this, I am going to go back into my reading room, and I have this whole card and a whole card after this, one side of a whole card after this, to start installing. And that's what I'm going to be doing for at least the next couple hours.